It may have been the greatest army of all time, conquering and controlling an empire that stretched right across the ancient world. It was ruthless, disciplined, and feared by all, not just by its enemies who died in their millions, but by its own emperors, who often paid the price of the army's wrath. And yet, these soldiers were builders as well as destroyers, helping to spread a culture that became the bedrock of Western civilization. What was it that made this army so dominant? How was it able to rule and reshape the classical world? And why did it eventually fall? This is the story of the Roman war machine. For any ancient people who refused Roman demands to surrender their town or city, weapons like these may have been among the last sights they witnessed on Earth. Siege warfare was one of Rome's greatest tools for winning and keeping control of its empire. The Roman siege weapons, adapted from the Greeks, gave them a tremendous versatility for conquest. This catapult for flinging heavy stones was called the ballista.
These are really designed to batter away at either bodies of men or particularly gateways, stone walls. It would take a long time to knock down a decently built stone wall, but you can lob the balls over the walls and hit the defenders who are hiding behind. Now the machine gets its power from twisted skeins of rope, which in ancient times were made of sinew or horsehair, and through each skein of rope goes an arm. So it's already under tension, and as they wind it back, the arms are put under increased tension. And we're using here a ball which is about the size of an orange, and this is found archaeologically very common. But the biggest ammunition from these machines comes from Israel, and that's in the form of stone balls weighing 100 weight. And to shoot that, the machine would be about 40 feet high.
Another siege machine was the catapulta, built like a crossbow, that fired heavy arrows and bolts with deadly accuracy.
It's designed to shoot arrows, but an arrow far bigger than you could shoot with a handheld bow. It's an arrow like this. It's heavy, it's got a large square-shaped tip, which would penetrate armor, penetrate shields, penetrate men. We know that when battering rams and siege towers were used, machines like this were positioned in them to give that covering fire as the machine moved towards the walls. And in field battles as well, these were very useful.
The Romans also had different types of siege weapons. They used high timber towers on wheels manned by archers to pick off enemy defenders, while movable structures, like tin sheds, were used to protect soldiers operating heavy battering rams. When attacking fortified towns, Roman soldiers often used the tortoise formation, locking their shields to protect themselves against the hail of enemy fire that would rain down from the walls. With all these weapons and tactics, there was almost no town or city in the ancient world capable of resisting the Romans, and those who tried were inviting slaughter and destruction. Perhaps the two most famous Roman sieges happened in what is now Israel. Judea, as it was known then, was conquered around the time of the birth of Jesus. But the native Jews bitterly resented the Romans, whom they regarded as heathen. And when the Roman governor demanded money from the Jewish temple, open revolt broke out in 66 AD. After 3 years of fighting, the Romans finally surrounded the main Jewish stronghold of Jerusalem. It took the Romans another 4 months to break through the 3 city walls protecting the temple. Catapults hurled huge stones at the defenders.
These large, dazzling white limestone blocks hurled in by the Romans to the city. And the besiegers had their own slang. When they saw one of these white stones coming, they would shout, "Here comes a baby!" And they'd all lie down in the hope that it would go across them and land safely. The Romans, becoming aware of this, actually blackened the white stones so that they wouldn't be so visible.
Once the Romans broke through, they ran wild, killing thousands of citizens and selling the rest into slavery. Jewish holy relics were carried off to Rome to be paraded in triumph, and the temple was destroyed.
If cities and communities in conquered areas quickly surrendered and came to terms with the Romans, they were generally pretty well treated. And in fact, their ruling classes were often given the Roman citizenship, sometimes very, very quickly, and could become quickly integrated into the Roman world. But people who continued to resist could expect very little mercy from the Roman state or the Roman army, and there were some cases where Roman behaviour amounted virtually to genocide.
The Romans later allowed the Jews to return to the temple site to mourn over the one remaining wall, hence the term Wailing Wall, and a tradition that continues today. Although the Jewish rebel cause was now hopeless, one band of zealots continued to hold out. They took over a fortress perched on a plateau rising 1,300 feet above the Dead Sea Plain south of Jerusalem. The fortress, called Masada, had been built 100 years earlier by King Herod in case of attack by the Egyptians. It seemed unassailable, and the 960 zealots dared the Romans to try.
Masada is symbolic. It's important for the Romans because the elimination of this last resistance stands as a symbol that nothing will stand in front of the Roman Empire.
There was no prospect of starving the place out anytime soon because Herod and his successors had put huge stores of food. There was plenty of water because Herod had constructed huge rain-fed cisterns inside the mountain that were fed during the winter rains. The only way to take Masada was by direct assault.
The 10th Roman Legion, which had led the assault on Jerusalem, arrived at the foot of Masada in late 72 AD. The Roman force, with its auxiliaries and forced Jewish labor, totaled about 10,000. It began by building a wall whose remains are still visible. It was 6 feet high and 3 miles long, stretching around the entire plateau. And it let the rebels know there was no chance of escape. Unlike the rebels, who were well housed and supplied, the Romans were camped in a desert that was scorching by day and freezing at night. Supplies for their camps had to be brought in from the Jerusalem area, 16 tons of food and 5,000 gallons of water, about 400 donkey loads each day. But then, logistics were among the Romans' greatest skills.
It's incredibly important, as was seen in the Gulf War, where millions of tons of equipment had to be moved in just so that the army could do its job. And the Romans were acutely aware of this, and their logistical organisation was really very good for the period, considering their limited technology. And of course, that is one of the main reasons they built all those roads, was to keep the army capable of moving and to keep it fed and supplied. Without these logistical skills, the Roman Empire couldn't have been maintained.
Now, the question for the 10th Legion was, how could it lay siege to the summit? From nearly every angle, the 1,300-foot cliffs were just too steep. But there was one possibility on the western side, where the height was only 250 feet, with a rocky outcrop that gave the chance of building a ramp for the siege equipment. The Romans and their laborers began building the ramp, protected by movable sheds with covering fire from archers and catapults. The Jewish defenders probably used slingshots as their defense. This pile of slinging stones was found on the site. Eventually, the Romans came to within 50 yards of the summit fortress. Just how long it took to build the ramp has been much debated.
The popular view is that the siege of Masada lasted for 2 or 3 years. I don't think there's any reason to think that the siege lasted more than 4 to 8 weeks. Most Roman sieges were fairly short. Siege of Jerusalem one of the most hardest fought of ancient times, took 4 months.
Once the ramp was finished, the Romans used their battering ram to break through the outer wall. But that wasn't enough, because the defenders had built a second wall behind it, made of wood and earth, that the battering ram could not budge.
The Romans responded by setting fire to the Jewish wall. And this seemed to work initially, but at one moment the fire blew back and looked like it might burn all the Roman siege engines. But as Flavius Josephus, who recorded this, said, God was on the Roman side and the fire blew in and burnt down the Jewish wall.
The Romans waited for the next morning to make their assault. And inside, the rebels knew that their capture would mean a terrible fate.
In most cases, rebels were enslaved, but they also might have been killed, even crucified, or sent to fight in gladiatorial games.
So the rebels decided their own fate. They drew lots to determine who would kill the women and children, and then each other. When the Romans burst in at daybreak, they were met only with silence. Then they were approached by 2 women and 5 children who'd hidden and escaped the mass suicide, and they told the Romans what had happened.
It's to the Romans' credit that they were amazed that this had happened, that they felt even in their victory there was an element of defeat.
Masada marked the end of the Jewish revolt. But it flared up again 60 years later when the Romans decided to build a settlement on the ruins of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. Jewish rebels fought the legions for 4 years, leaving many thousands of Jews dead. Many of the survivors were forced to leave Judea, adding to the Jewish dispersion. By the year 100 AD, the Roman Empire had been expanding for some 4 centuries, and under the Emperor Trajan, himself a general, the expansion continued. He annexed Dacia in modern Romania, and Armenia and Arabia, and he drove deep into present-day Iraq, reaching the Persian Gulf in 116 AD. But these new conquests stretched the Roman army to capacity. When Trajan died in 117 AD, he left another general, Hadrian, as his successor. Hadrian quickly reversed the expansionist policy, pulling out of Iraq and fixing the empire's borders.
He had seen the human cost of that and how difficult it was for the Romans to expand any further into lands which were apparently more capable of resisting them.
Hadrian did not just draw lines on a map. He had very visible boundaries built on the frontiers. In Germany, it was a 9-foot wooden palisade, now partly reconstructed on site, which ran for 350 miles between the Rhine and the Danube as a control line against German tribes. Even more emphatically, he ordered the building of Hadrian's Wall, running about 80 miles from sea to sea across northern England. It was 15 feet high and dotted with forts that altogether housed about 10,000 soldiers. Partial reconstructions show how astonishing it must have looked to British tribes. The ancient writers say only that it was built to separate the Romans from the barbarians, and archaeological evidence at one fort near the wall, Vindolanda, shows there were battles in the region not long before the wall was built.
Romans had a lot of casualties, with commanding officers being killed. That's very unusual. And of course that, to a certain extent, gives a reason for building the wall. A lot of trouble, Hadrian puts it down, we'll make damn certain it doesn't happen again, build the wall.
The soldiers themselves built the wall by hand. 3 legions, about 15,000 men, took nearly 10 years, and it was finished about 130 AD. But there were more than just defensive reasons for building it. Many believe Hadrian was making a statement to his own generals, who enjoyed the Roman tradition of conquest and booty.
Under Augustus, Virgil writes his poem saying, the gods have given Rome an empire without end in time or space. And this Hadrian says,